Buenas tardes, vuelvo a decir a todos y a todas. Gracias por venir esta tarde a acompañarnos en la presentación del libro de Clémentine Deliss, que es un honor para el Museo Thyssen tenerla aquí como invitada para que nos cuente su experiencia, que ya la relata en el libro, como directora del Museo de las Culturas de Frankfurt y bueno, sus otros proyectos que ha ido haciendo, inmensos proyectos y enormes a lo largo del tiempo, rompedores todos ellos y que creo que va a ser muy interesante para todos. Bueno, voy a introducir, presentar aunque ya posiblemente la conocéis por el libro, porque el libro es un bestseller, se ha convertido, enhorabuena. Clémentine Deliss trabaja más allá de las fronteras del arte contemporáneo, la antropología crítica y la práctica curatorial y la edición. Es curator at large en Canal Saint-Pompidou en Bruselas, donde está ampliando su idea de museo-universidad en relación con las colecciones de Bruselas. Dirige la cátedra honoraria de Global Humanities Professorship in History of Art en la Universidad de Cambridge. Entre 2020 y 2023 ha sido comisaria asociada del KW Institute for Contemporary Art de Berlín y su exposición en el KW, Skin in the Game, incluyó prototipos fundamentales de artistas como Ruth Buchanan, Otto Kanga, Collier Shore, Rosemarie Trockel, Joel Tuerlich y Andrea Sittel. Entre 2010 y 2015, como sabéis si habéis leído el libro, fue directora del Weltkulturen Museum de Frankfurt, donde instituyó un nuevo laboratorio transdisciplinario para rehabilitar colecciones dentro de un paradigma posetnológico, trabajando con una amplia gama de artistas, abogados, escritores, incluyendo a Otto Kanga, a Luke Willis Thompson, Angie Majewski, Thomas Carlyle, Tom McCarthy y Ehaid Si. Su libro The Metabolic Museum de 2020, publicado por la editorial Hans Kahn, ha sido traducido al ruso en 2021 en Garage Museum y al español en marzo de 2023 en la editorial Caniche de Madrid, que es el libro que nos concita hoy a todos nosotros. Su reciente libro, Skin in the Game, Conversation on Risk and Contention, La piel en juego, conversaciones sobre riesgo y contención, fue publicado en diciembre de 2023 por Hans Kahn y KW. Actualmente vive en Berlín y es, como he dicho, un honor para nosotros, para el museo, tenerla aquí con nosotros en el marco de la próxima exposición que vamos a inaugurar en junio sobre la memoria colonial en las colecciones Thyssen-Bornemisza. Muchas gracias, Clémentine.
Good evening. I'm not sure, is it working? Yes, it's working. Thank you so much, Juan, for the introduction, and thank you for coming, everybody, on a day when it's sunny outside and you should be in the countryside. I too, but we're here and I'm honored to be at the Museo Thyssen-Bornemisza. It's a real honor. It's also an honor for me to launch the book, which I don't have now in my hand. Let me get a copy. Because I was really delighted when Caniche Edición in Madrid decided to translate it, translate the small pink book that came out in 2020 called The Metabolic Museum. And when you look at it, you see there are no photographs, right? There's nothing to show you what it looked like, what I write about. And that's why I'm going to show you photographs today. I wrote it in the tradition of field reports or field diaries. I studied contemporary art in the late 70s in Vienna, so I come from a conceptual art, post-minimal, I guess, performance art background. And I was too young to realize that maybe I could become an artist, so I went to university. And I became a curator at a time when there was neither artistic research nor curatorial education. And it makes me very critical of curatorial practice today. I have lots of polemics. But I realized so this is a picture of me. I should have put it on the, maybe we can move one up. Could you put the PowerPoint on? There. Let's begin with that. So you can read that while I'm talking. It's a picture of me in the office of the great Michel Leiris, who was one of the only people, together with Malinowski, and Paul Rabenow, so three key people who wrote field reports, who wrote diaries, who came back from field work. And in the case of Malinowski, it was more brutal. It was like, he just wanted to have sex. He didn't understand why he was there. It's quite racist. But it was published posthumously. In the case of Michel Leiris, it's more interesting. It's called Fantôme Afrique. I don't know if it's been published in Spanish. It's a fat book, and he went to Gaimard in 1931. He knew he was going on a collecting expedition to cross Africa, and he decided to sell the rights to his diary. And he came back, and in 1933, he published L'Afrique Fantôme, and it is a day-by-day diary of his movement between Dakar to Djibouti, and what happened when they tried to bring back, and did bring back, 3,500 objects. So this is me with a dogon mask in his office. He was still alive. And the third person who wrote a field diary is Paul Rabenow. Rabenow is famous from the 80s because he wrote the most useful and most intelligent reader, I would say, on Foucault. He had greeted Foucault when Foucault came to Berkeley, and he was a student of Clifford Geertz, a famous anthropologist, an interesting anthropologist, and he went out and did field work with Geertz in Morocco and came back and wrote a thin book called Reflections on Fieldwork in Morocco. And the Metabolic Museum, El Museo Metabólico, is part of that tradition. In other words, it is not objective. It is a biographical accounting, if you like, of what happens when you do field work. But in my case, it was field work in a museum, not in the field. And the reason that I took on this museum was that I had been working for 8 years as a curator on the question of what a future art academy might look like, or what brings people to create institutions. So this museum was born out of an aristocratic collection. And in the case of universities in the States, it's a good example, the building of a new institute has often been connected to the development of a collection or the gifts of artists. And I was, because if you say you want to create a new type of autonomous, independent research institution, a place where artists can work, where they're not like today being formatted and education is standardized, how do you do it? Do you do it because you have money? Do you do it because you have a group of friends? Do you do it because you write a curriculum? Or do people invest in it by giving works, symbolic capital? And that's, of course, in many ways the most interesting, and it's what I had encountered in Dakar with my friends, the artists I hung out with in the 90s, where they had developed that kind of symbolic capital with artworks in order to fund projects. And so I thought to myself, well, what about all these old research collections? All these things that people have gathered, have extracted, have brought back to Europe as part of the kind of colonial endeavor. And I became more and more interested in the fact that if I wanted to run a museum, and I was 50 and I needed to, you know, find a home, then the worst museum I can think of is an ethnographic museum. There is nothing that you can do to come out clean. You have a stigma on your forehead if you touch this kind of material. It doesn't matter how. So for me, these museums, they no longer exist, but the collections exist. And there are aspects of these collections which today, I think, beyond questions of restitution, are essential, absolutely essential for future civic education. And that's why I work on a museum university, which I'll tell you about in the end. Now, this is the result of an expedition in the 60s that German anthropologists undertook with tax money from the Frankfurters. They went to Papua New Guinea. You couldn't get further away. And they were convinced in the vein of salvage anthropology or Rettungsethnologie, I don't know, there'll be a term in Spanish. They were convinced that these cultures were going to die out. Yeah? So the 60s, the attitude was, let's go there, let's get everything, bring it back before it's all dead and these people don't exist anymore. And when you look at this picture, you will see, I can use my little thingy, that you don't have one lime spatula, you don't have one bridal headdress, you don't have, you know, they brought it back, a crazy expedition, yeah? And they put it into a depot in the east of Frankfurt. But really what they were doing is they were swapping, okay? So if you have 20 ethnographic museums in a country like Germany, you can never build an encyclopedic museum unless you swap. Because if Juan goes to Congo and brings back one in Kisi, and I go to Papua New Guinea and bring back one bridal headdress, and we sit there saying we've got the best collection, then we can't serve this idea of the world museum, right? So this swapping went on right through until the 80s, when suddenly the museum curators said, oh, we swapped the wrong piece. Right? But in the meantime, they had collected and collected and collected. So this museum that I took over had 70,000 objects. None of them could be deaccessioned. None of them could be given back at the time. Restitution wasn't being discussed at all. This is 2010. So I was given, I applied for the job in Frankfurt. I told them I was going to bring artists in. I didn't bluff. I have a very ambivalent relationship to anthropology, ethnology, and on top of it, I had never studied ethnology in Germany. And in 2010, everybody who ran a museum had studied in Germany, historicist anthropology. But I did art, and I did then semantic anthropology in London and in Paris. So I was part of this nihilistic deconstruction of the colonial parameters of this discipline. Okay, so this is where everything happened. And of course, the city of Frankfurt said, we'll build you a new building, design a building. And I had worked so hard on this future academy that I knew what I wanted, but I knew secretly that I didn't want a new building, that I wanted to work with these 3 villas. So here you had, in the basement, you had 13,000 objects from Africa. Here you had 2 floors of exhibition space. Here you had a very run-down educational department with fairy things where children could have parties. This had a library with 50,000 books and the offices. And this building, the old police station, was empty. It had had a gallery at some point, but it had been renovated and it looked like a bathroom, and there's no way that I could put a show in there. So I got rid of all the stuff in there, and that was the heart of the project. But first, let me show you what the depot looked like. So this is a photograph by Armin Linke. What you have here is one floor Africa, one floor Southeast Asia, one floor Americas, from North America right down to Patagonia, yeah? One floor Southeast Asia. So you would literally go in the lift to a new continent, and inside you would see this. Totally crazy, yeah? Every single, do you look? All these are keys. Do you see any kind of here, I can't read this here, but basically, there's just no way you could know what's inside. You couldn't see anything. So you had 4 curators, and each one was the expert. But each curator had 15,000 objects. So, you know, they wanted to show their favorite object, the shell in which you would blow, this particularly ornate piece from Borneo or whatever. And I realized immediately that I was an ignoramus. I didn't study tribal art, forgive me. I didn't study this. I was only interested in contemporary work. So I never pretended I knew anything. I just knew about contemporary work, right? So I would go in and I would say, so could we open the drawers, please? And she would open the drawers, and I would pull these out, these drawers, and then ask, what is this? What is this? What is this? And eventually I got to know what it was. And the first thing I did was to employ a very good photographer, somebody who usually takes pictures for galleries, and got him to photograph everything that I did. But it's not in the book. The first person I invited to the museum, because by then I knew I was going to have residencies with lawyers, with writers, with artists. I didn't want it to be placed under the notion of indigeneity. I wanted this to be accessible to everybody. And it was really important for me not to follow the same track as the ethnographers of the museum who, and I mean, it's a big problem, but we'll come back to that. Let me just show you the first guest. Oops. Werner Herzog. So I thought to myself, you know what, if I'm going to do a real fuck-off exhibition in this museum in Frankfurt, if I could get Werner Herzog to do a show with me, then not only would we be bringing out objects from the parts where he's, you know, he's filmed, but it would also kind of give a certain status to this completely forgotten museum. He came, he asked the custodians to look for objects that gave them a sense of wonder. He wasn't talking about curiosity cabinets, he was talking about something else. And he hit on this belt. Whoops. He hit on this belt, which comes from the Baule people in Côte d'Ivoire. And the story is that if a warrior puts it on, they shrink to the size of an ant. So this was very brilliant kind of woven leather, and he said it was algebraic. And he said if he was work with me, then he would bring in mathematicians and filmmakers, and he would really kind of shake things up. But unfortunately, it didn't work because he was cutting 2 films and shooting Lawrence of Arabia, and there was lots of stuff going on. And also he told me that he never went to museums. So but it was very significant to have had him there. And then later, Otobong Nkanga, who you see here, who just had a big show at IVAM, she also picked up on this crazy belt. When you look at it, you don't know how it's woven, right? And then I began to realize that there were artifacts in this museum that had nothing to do with masks and rituals, but that because anthropologists had been the bailiffs of other cultures. Do you know what a bailiff is? A bailiff is when you don't pay your tax and you owe money. Some guy comes in, rings the doorbell, shoves his foot in the door and says, "Let me in," and takes everything you have. anthropologists were the bailiffs of other cultures. They went into these countries, into these smaller places, into these villages, and they took everything with which people eat, sleep, pray, clothe themselves, cook food, everything, yeah? So if you imagine how gross this is and how significant it is today, if you have a kid who has a diasporic background and they want to study engineering, or they want to study design or ecology or anything, religious studies, where do they find the material? On Instagram? Where? It's all in the reserves of museums in Europe, and it's inaccessible, okay? It's not so that you can see these things. You have to know in advance what it is you want. You have to have the right type of application in order to be granted access. So this is something that I found, which I thought was a prototype. There were many things in there in the collection that I felt were unfinished, right? It wasn't enough to say, this is a mat from Borneo, it is used in the jungle and placed on the ground, and the Batak, I'm not sure exactly which group uses it, blah, blah, blah. But I looked at it and I thought, if you produced something like this today with, at the time it was the Occupy movement, yeah? With Occupy space, you would be making a statement on the public use of the city. And this kind of beautiful thing would be as ubiquitous as this kind of a thing, right? You would be able to sit down wherever you want. So I saw these objects as really powerful. And what happened was that I invited artists to come. They received 4,000 euros for 4 weeks. This is 15 years ago, right? Remember, it was a good deal. It would be a good deal today. And they were given an apartment and access. I'll show you all of this. But what they did, what they could do, what nobody else could do in the stores, was to create assemblages. So assemblages like Kyle Parry calls it an expressive gathering, right? It's something which has both precision and vagueness in it. It's something where contextual knowledge about the individual object sort of goes into an overdrive. It's pushed to its limit, because what you have here, whoops, sorry, I'm not quite in here yet. Whoa, I've gone way too fast. Yeah, what you have here are objects that belong to Antimayevsky, like this Chinese teapot, but then there are artifacts like this spatula from Papua New Guinea or the Cameroonian hat. They're from different places. So she's brought things, she's placed them on the table, and that is the trigger for whatever it is she's going to do in the museum. So this is what the museum looked like. This is the laboratory. Top floor apartments. This floor studio spaces. This was the apartments, studio spaces, laboratory, archive. 24-hour access, no problem, no curator looking over your shoulder, not like the Schaulager in Basel, where if you want to see works by Boltanski or whoever, you need to apply, of course, that's normal, but you can't really go in for more than an hour and a half, and you don't have a table, and you have a curator standing next to you. We trusted the artists, right? So this was the apartment that they were given. It was nice. I cleaned it up. I renovated, very little money, bought secondhand George Nelson furniture. It was fun. It was fun to do this, and it wasn't like one of those residencies where you have a sink and a small bed in a corner and no coffee and nothing to eat. There was a fridge full of wine and food when you arrived. We cared for the people because we knew that they would be producing. We didn't want full-on production. We're not a gallery. We just wanted the beginnings of a new procedure. This was the library. Nobody went there. It was a civic library, public library, but it was only open between 7 o'clock in the morning and 12 in noon. So you had to be really spaced out and come out of the Robert Johnson Club or something to want to go and sit in that library. Then we had a lot of missionary archives, not very nice material. And this is what the lab looked like. So I had to have furniture made, because if you do this kind of work, you can't go to IKEA or to a business, you can't buy business furniture. You need furniture that will convince the conservators that you are not harming the objects, right? Because anything you touch is already the harming of the life of the object in the ideology of conservation. So I asked Mathis Esterhazy, who's known for having worked with Franz West, to construct modular furniture on wheels. Oh, I'm so sorry. Let me go back. Yeah, on wheels. Basically 2 types of shelf and table system. Here you see it again. And this was an area where the artist's works, whoever was the writer, for example, they were brought in here, they were set up, and this kind of space was only for the guest, not for the public. So this is us working in the lab. I mean, you have to imagine, normally in a museum, you have the exhibition and you have the depot, and you have a data bank. You have no place where you can look at things and decide, should we use this? Oh my God, I hadn't seen it. Is that what it looks like, right? It looks like this. Wow. What happens if we bring this next to it? What goes on? So there's no actual physical architecture to allow this kind of work, because the depot is 16 degrees. It has a concrete floor. It smells of moth repellent. Yeah. So this is what Ottobon did. I mean, she was the second artist after Antje Majewski. She decided to work on jewelry, currency, and weapons. And all this material was brought in for her to work around. Here in the studio, she started planning. And so all the books then, it's sort of Warburg-like, they all came from the library. And she could do what she wanted in that studio. And if she got tired, she went upstairs and could sleep or cook. This is the same studio in different moments. In particular, this was a moment when I decided to work with fashion designers. It made complete sense. So you have Buki Akib from Nigeria. You have a kind of guys on the top right, who literally bought sewing machines and made prototypes. And on the top left, you have the Australian designers Perks and Minnie, or Pam. And they again built a whole collection around what they did in the museum. But of course, then the custodians wouldn't inventorize them. They refused, because it didn't fit in their classification system. It wasn't Africa, it was a mix. So they would just, appalling. This is Cassette Player, a designer from London with the blonde. And here we're really working on the material in the photographic archive. And then, of course, every person who was a guest gave a public lecture, but in the public lecture, there were always the objects that they had worked with. So if I tell you today that I'm honored to be talking to you in this museum, I can also tell you, quite frankly, that I hate talking in an auditorium. I would love to give the talk in the large spaces of the museum, and I kind of try to insist on this, but today everything is so divided up, everything is so standardized, that the idea that we might talk about this work and then look at a painting at the same time, it doesn't enter into the concept of public events. And it did used to, right? But now we have to do this kind of strange blowing up of things. All right, and this is what the exhibition space looked like. So again, designed by Mathis Esterhazy, very minimal. Here on the wall, you see the big mind map that she made in the studio, and she left that to the museum. And that's where I got my kind of kick as a curator, because I like working with the beginnings of a production. I'm not really interested in working with either dead artists, nor am I interested in doing historical shows, nor am I interested in biennials. I want to do the work where the dialogue that I have with a living artist becomes significant for both of us and shapes an exhibition. So everything that took place in the laboratory led to the exhibition. And if, for example, one of the designers said, oh, I'm working on musical instruments and not clothing, then I had to rethink my exhibition. So there was this, a real kind of symbiosis between the lab, and here you see more shots of this is the first show, Object Atlas, Fieldwork in the Museum. There are very significant catalogs in English and in German for all these exhibitions. But you get a sense, I won't go into the detail because it would take too long, but there was always the new prototype and the material that was part of the, part of the concept. Or here, a very complex exhibition called Foreign Exchange, or The Stories You Wouldn't Tell a Stranger, about colonial photography. Boxes of penises that we found in the museum that had been hidden. Appalling photographs taken by the founding director of this museum. And here, trading style, and just wanted to show you the piece on the left, which caused outrage amongst the custodians, but led to loads of young people coming into the museum, young women and kids who really wanted a sense of what was this figure. So what you have here is a mask from the Sepik. Then you have, all this is Perks and Mini, Saruel trousers from Nigeria, and then Perks and Mini shoes. And this was considered total heresy to do this. It was, the argument went along the lines of, if somebody from Papua New Guinea walked into the museum, they would be appalled. So I said, so what do you suggest? And they said, well, you have to build the altar, you have to create the context. Now, frankly, recreation of an altar in a villa in Frankfurt is as absurd to me as this kind of hybridity, which in a way tells you more about youth and youth style today and the diasporas that are interwoven than some kind of fake ethnographic presentation. El Hadji Si, the last artist, who, to be noted, way before Okwi and Wezoa, was a curator in Germany. He comes from the Laboratoire Agitar. He's an artist, an activist, a painter, and he had been commissioned by this museum in 1986 to create a new collection of Senegalese art. And that's also the reason why I went there. And so we gave him a retrospective, and that's him. These are the crates that he made to bring his work back from Dakar. And here what he's doing is, if you like, recasting the much maligned relationship of primitivism by taking one of his own paintings from 1987 and placing objects in front of it, including the belt, the Baule belt, to see what happens. And here are some shots of his exhibition. Again, taking Papuan stools, placing them on a painting. And a big drawing on butchers, meat packing paintings of the former president, Wad. Or here, two early works from the 90s on jute sacking in reaction to Leopold Sédar Senghor's tapestry production. Beautiful, beautiful works. And then in the front, two Ethiopian chairs from the collection. Okay. I left the museum. I had, unbeknownst to me, there was a lobby working against me, and I ended up having to take the city of Frankfurt to court for unfair dismissal, and I won. And that's what the little book is about, but it's not me washing my dirty linen. It's much more to try and understand. In fact, what the book tells you is the reasoning why I did this, why I brought in artists, what I was trying to do with this act of remediation. What were the ramifications? For example, how could I estimate the value of the works that were done when the 70,000 objects, which never circulate, had completely bizarre values placed upon them by the curators, right? It's a municipal museum. Every year you have to put on the value of what you have, but nothing circulates, so how do you estimate this value? Huh? This is a major issue, and I think this question of deaccessioning is really important today. You can't hoard this material. You have to let go. And the problem with restitution politics, it's all very important, yeah? Incredibly important, but it's focusing on things that maybe aren't the first thing that the youth might want to work on, new generations. It's still within the framework of 19th century taste. So I went to Kiev. I was invited to Kiev, and that's when I began the Museum University. And it was a very simple proposition. I gave a talk like now, and then I was there for a week as part of the Biennale in 2015, and I said, does anybody want to come with me to the flea market? Please come, and please, if you have some money, I don't have any money, but with your budget, please see if you can find artifacts that evoke contention, that are complex, that are charged. And if you can, buy them. And they did, and they brought them back to the museum in Kiev, and we found some old tables downstairs. They placed them on the tables and began working. And the next day, we took over that table and we brought it into the entrance of the museum. So immediately when somebody walked in, they were confronted with a seminar. But not a seminar with a PowerPoint, a seminar with an assemblage, an expressive gathering of objects that were contentious, right? Make love, not war, pieces of Russian bureaucracy, all kinds of things, strange limbs. And it was very powerful for me to see this happen. And afterwards, when I was teaching in Karlsruhe, I asked my students to work on furniture. Because what we forget is that we are now being asked to walk around huge exhibitions with no place to sit down and no place to work. If you look for a bench, like I do, like an obsessive, in a museum, the bench will most likely be near the garderobe, near the cloakroom, near the toilets, never in front of a piece unless you're in the Louvre or something, because I was told, if you put a bench in front of an artwork, then you make the artwork into a masterpiece, and that's a problem with the works next door. So it's all this completely warped idea of how people, for different reasons to do with security, should behave in an exhibition. And it makes me crazy. So I asked them to work on it, and they created metabolic chairs. And what you have is basically a cheap chair that they bought online. They give it a tongue-shaped table. They have a light, and you might be in a museum with a video, and you want to work inside the dark room, so you need a light. And then you have a thing to hang your bag on, but more important, you can spam the hang. In other words, you have a mini projector here, yeah? So these are two people in a museum. They sit down, they use their Bluetooth or the Wi-Fi, and they beam their Instagram between the two paintings. And as a result, they not only auto-curate, but they can't avoid looking left and right. So they create their own system of referentiality whilst in a process of visual thinking, yeah? It's very important. The labels may be there, but something else is going on. And at that point, we made 26 of these chairs and squatted the museums in Ljubljana, right? So we didn't do it in a brutal way. The museum directors were happy about this. It was part of the Slavs and Tatars Biennale. But basically, we went to these museums and set up, and postdocs, not great lecturers, but people who had just finished studying, gave talks. And the students changed the names of the day, because it's metabolic, obviously, to Skin Day, Liver Day, Heart Day. And we tried to develop conversations with the visitors who sat down and took part in the seminars. This is the democratic intellect, right? Because it's only in a museum that you don't need an exam. You want to go to study. You are a migrant. You are forced out of your home country where your school certificate would be absolutely sufficient, or your exams, your PhDs, whatever, as a professor would allow you to teach. You come to a country like Germany, forget it. You can't walk in. You need exams, let alone money. Yeah? So you can neither study nor can you teach in these. Even me, after 15 years, I don't get a full professorship. And now I'm a German, right? So if you think about it, the art academy, the art school demand diplomas. The only area with a high level of material, really extraordinarily productions of human beings, the only civic institution is a museum. So the motto of what I do is to enter a museum, you don't need an exam. Yet. Well, okay. And that's what I did at KW. I started to put a faculty together. Again, a group of people who would come from different locations. I felt that we might want to create an institution together. I thought that KW could do with an institute for concept work. And then, you know, but unfortunately what happened, and here was our first meeting with Iman Issa. This is inside the exhibition of Hassan Sharif. So if you can imagine spamming the hang or squatting the exhibitions, you can also, and this interests me a lot, do ultra-temporary exhibitions of 3 hours, which are inserted in an existing exhibition, which is stagnant after 2 or 3 weeks anyway, but because of the rigidity of frames of time in museums, 3 months, 6 months, take it down, 10 days, build it up, 6 months, yeah, this madness, completely unsustainable madness. If you bring in an assemblage and you do a 3-hour exhibition within the space, you are bouncing off, like I mentioned earlier, a whole number of references that otherwise would be left somehow on the walls. Do you know what I mean? So we did this once, and then the pandemic took over. And after that, and we did a lot online, and that's what's in Skin in the Game, the other book, the second book, all the debates around collections. And then I decided to run a debating chamber at KW, and did it with an assemblage of different objects on the basis of the liver of Piacenza. So Babylonian divinatory mapping of a liver in relation to astrological houses. So what you see on the right is a table I made, but it's not a casino, and it's not a map of New York. It is actually the liver of Piacenza. And, you know, it was difficult. It was very difficult, quite simply, because people are not used to being confronted with a group of objects and no formal structure. Yes, XYZ is going to talk for 20 minutes about the subject of. You know, like conferences are, they're all the same, yeah? So here, instead of having us just speak, we had these strange agent objects that were mirroring us and that were pushing us to think in a transdisciplinary way. And it was, here you have the lawyer, El-Haj Abdoulaye Sen. Here you have Ruth Buchanan, Anna Gritz, a curator, Matt Mullican, Augustin Morse, the composer, and me at the top. And it lasted for 3 hours, and I can tell you it was tough going, but it meant that maybe something was important. And now, just 2 more slides, I guess. I wanted just to say that I will come back to the website, but I've worked a lot on how to deal with online, with an online venue, because, and you can look yourselves at the website. I'm not going to describe it now. But I just wanted to tell you that right now, the work I'm doing, both in Brussels, but this is in Kassel, is to, in Brussels for Canal, I'm looking at collections, and I'm asking one question. But with Brussels, I found another question. But I usually begin with the question, what can you not exhibit? Before, 2 years ago, I would have said, what is contentious? Huh? And now I don't use that word because it's in itself contentious. So so in the Baroque masters in the castle on Wilhelmshöhe in Kassel, we went with my students to see the Baroque paintings, and I phoned the man beforehand and I said, what have you got that is close to the Latin term nefandum? Nefandum, that means that which cannot be spoken, that which cannot be seen, and that signified sodomy in the medieval period. And it's for me a very important word. And he said, we have a painting of a white woman and some African figures, Baroque painting. It was shown in Documenta 13. You can see that. And then we turned up, and the man pulled out these racks of paintings. And he said, when we do an exhibition, there are 3 qualities we look for, 3 attributes: history, canon, and quality. Those 3. If a painting doesn't have quality, history, canon, we don't show it. And then he pulled these things out, and we're like, what? What is this? What is this? And he said, yes, well, you can see we can't restore it. It's so badly damaged, it can't be restored. It's not quality that we can really deal with. It's kind of lost its quality for that reason. But it's historically terribly important, so we hold on to it. And he said, if we were to try and sell it, we'd have to pay the guy to come and take these paintings away. And he said he had 60 of them, at which point my students, they were just like, they were like taking photographs, they were going crazy. Because in a way, what you have here is an imagistic switch, because the students can look at this material and they can begin to think of grafting, of cosmetic surgery, of interventions, of chemicals. They can think of so much, and they see the weathering of art history. They don't see these glossy paintings that are neatly placed and all clean and hygienic, right? They see what's going on. In particular, the one on the left, you can see that this very fine lint has been placed to stop the pigment falling off. And I think, so my work at the moment is to locate artifacts and collections in Brussels that have to do with traps, right? Because Brussels is so pathological, the atmosphere, the character, and the feuding, and the history, and you think everything is under the carpet, And I'm sure Madrid would yield a very different idiom. I would love to do this in Madrid. But in Brussels, it's this idea of the trap, the ruse, the fake, the trickster, the con artist, the trompe-l'œil, the détournement, but it's also cages and shackles and fish traps and all of these other things. And I'm working with a Congolese architect, a student in architecture, who's one of the few students I've found, and I'm happy, who has taken, for example, a comb, a Luba comb from Congo, and he's 22 years old and is already thinking of social architecture based on the comb. And it's that way of working that I hope to generate with different collections in Brussels. So that's what a museum university is. It's saying the university crashes into the museum, people come in, they sit down, there's furniture, they look around them, they act with grace, right? They're not going to be shouting and speaking on their phones. It's like a library in some ways, but it's based on visual thinking. And it's based also on a kind of a destabilizing of disciplinary context, which comes from colonialism and is a reflection of the institutions that were built in the 19th century and earlier. So if you want to know more, it's at MMU online. Thank you. Very long. I hope I didn't, it's okay.
Thank you very much, Clementine. Bueno, tenemos un poco de tiempo para poder conversar con Clémentine. Yo tengo algunas preguntas, pero me gustaría que también vosotros participaseis, le preguntaseis lo más posible todas aquellas, bueno, todas las actividades y su replanteamiento del museo etnológico, sobre todo, etnográfico, son totalmente renovadoras y yo creo que ponen en cuestión el museo en general, la idea de museo en general. Me gustaría, siguiendo un poco para comenzar el libro, lo que planteas en el libro, que si pudiese recordar un poco la relación que hace en el libro de el fundador del museo, del Weltkulturen Museum, Bernhard Hagen, y su relación entre comercio y etnología, que me parece que es muy reveladora. Hay un párrafo en concreto en el libro que habla sobre esto, cómo la etnología puede servir para crear conocimiento con la función de desarrollar el imperio comercial alemán, ¿no? En principio. Es un poco la...
Yes, that was the second exhibition that we started working on, where the museum faced the banks, right? So you look at the banks every day, you look at the banks and you think, so what have the banks got to do with this museum? And then that thing happened where the visual anthropologist running the picture archive called me and said, Frau Deliss, come downstairs, we found something. And that's when she found these photographs taken by the founding director of hundreds of naked men, front, side, back, and then their genitalia photographed, photographs of dead embryos. And so the story behind it is simple. He was a doctor, and in the late 19th century, the European colonial powers had plantations in Sumatra, for example, where they grew tobacco. And they would have, I mean, it's so like today, it's incredible. They would have migrant workers who would come from all over the world. And they used extremely toxic fertilizers. And so as a result, everybody working in the fields got skin disease. And each colonial country would send their doctors out. So the Belgians had theirs, the Germans theirs. And as a result, Bernhard Hagen, who was a doctor and a sort of scientific mind, realized that it was nirvana, that he could make a comparative analysis of these people from Afghanistan, from Malaysia, from Congo, from everywhere, India. And so he built a makeshift studio and he took these photographs. Why he took the genitalia is unclear. In fact, the whole thing is unclear, except that, of course, it was within this racist development of racism through science in Germany. And when that happened, we also started looking at the missionary material. And that's when we realized that these missionaries were also taking appalling photographs right into the 60s of women with their legs apart in order to show genitalia, to show deformations, to show different things, and that this was being used as sponsor material. So they would go back to base, back to the mission and say, look, do you realize what these people are doing to themselves? Give us more money. And so that whole connection between sponsorship and trade and anthropology became so grotesque. It really, also the fact that Bernhard Hagen, when he declared the museum open in 1904, he speaks about the geography of trade. And I mean, we all know this. We all know that anthropology was the handmaiden of colonialism. We know that people were being educated in these. Why do you think they brought all the stuff, the households back, in order to show the bourgeois and the administrator how other people live in order to govern them? as Griol said in France, you can't govern a people unless you know them, right? So very insidious, yeah. But we held many seminars, and in the book, Foreign Exchange or the Stories You Wouldn't Tell a Stranger, we held with the custodians of the museum, I always integrated them, we held really very sharp seminars on all sorts of questions. For example, what is the relationship between the photography of people, this inhuman photography, and then this fetishized kind of highly steroid style of photography of so-called ethnography or tribal art? You pick up any book on old historical art from Africa, it's nearly always with black background, spotlight, blah, blah. It's very sort of, and I wanted to understand the relationship between object photography and human photography. So we had one seminar on that, for example, with lots of speakers coming over from South Africa, or, you know, it was very transdisciplinary. And all that was then became the kind of the questioning that was shown in the exhibition.
En el libro, Clementine, escribes, en concreto, voy a citar, en un museo etnográfico, los relatos aún conservan las dialécticas de amo y esclavo, que concuerdan con los lenguajes de aislamiento y control, como sucede con los términos guardián, custodio y conservador. En el libro hablas en concreto de, bueno, haces una comparación, haces muchas comparaciones metafóricas, pero muy interesantes, por ejemplo, entre los grandes depósitos de obras de arte escondidos en la parte subterránea de los museos o en las reservas de los museos, y las bodegas de los barcos negreros, que me parece como una comparación muy interesante. También, por ejemplo, el mercado del arte o la expoliación de los países por parte de estos antropólogos europeos, y el comercio de órganos, ¿no? Que también es que la idea del órgano está en la base de tu idea de museo metabólico, ¿no? Como el museo como un órgano enfermo, en cierto modo, ¿no? Sí.
Yeah, I mean, that idea of the metabolic comes out of the fact that I was always looking at this, even in the language, you speak of a corpus of a collection, right? So there was on the one hand the corpus of the visitor that bothered me the whole time, right? These people walking around, this whole difficulty of knowing how long you spend time, the timing, the ergonomy bothered me. Then this question of the corpus of the collection, and then I wanted an interdependency to grow. I wanted the museum to be 50% research, 50% exhibition. And I wanted to change, so if I had a library and a studio and a kitchen and the different organs, if you like, all had to work together to make the museum function. It wasn't just, okay, like if you think about how rooms are used in a museum, it's so rigid. You wouldn't imagine that somebody might say, oh, let's shift all of this, put it in the front, in the entrance, in where you have the portraits of the Baron and his wife, right? Let's put the chairs there. Why not? No, or let's make this into a cinema or a cafe, or or maybe we use this to maybe where can we put the apartments? It's so rigid. It's as if it's got to stay like this for the next 200 years or something. Yes. And when you think of when private collections were made into state collections in France, for example, or in Britain at the end of the 18th century, you had to apply to go to the British Museum. You had to wear the right clothing, and only artists were allowed in the Louvre in the beginning. Yes, so all these things can be shifted a little bit if not all museums have to look the same, but nearly all museums are the same today, in the sense of the dispositif of how they work. So the metabolic is really to try and look at a museum as a changing, transforming organism and not as something divorced from us. We
como
are...
un conjunto de reglas, ¿no?
Yeah, I
Yes.
mean, an institution, Pistoletto, Michelangelo Pistoletto always said to me, we don't like institutions, but we think only of prisons and hospitals, but an institution is us. We make it. It's as good as we are. And sometimes I think we forget that.
No sé si hay preguntas. Ahora traen un micrófono. Quería también preguntarte un poco, me gusta la idea de, o sea, creo que es muy importante en tu pensamiento y en tu libro la idea de remediación, ¿no? Que está tomada de Rainbow. Y la idea de que el museo en realidad puede servir un poco para, sobre todo a través de las residencias de los artistas, cómo repensar de una manera interdisciplinar, repensar otra vez las colecciones, repensar el papel del museo en la historia, etc. Te quería preguntar un poco sobre esta distinción que haces en el libro, que me parece muy interesante, entre las colecciones de los museos y las colecciones de investigación, que me parece como un planteamiento también muy renovador, que en cierto modo me recuerda al Atlas Mnemosyne de Aby Warburg, ¿no? Creo que hay algo en tu manera de combinar objetos y hacer que unos objetos junto a otros den lugar a nuevas significaciones. Hay un poco de ese pensamiento de Aby Warburg, ¿no?
Yeah, I wanted, maybe this makes it easier then to understand, because I'm not in that museum anymore, right? It's over, it's gone back to what it was. So when I work in Brussels, for example, I'm looking for secondary collections. Everything I'm telling you about a museum university is not to do with masterpieces. It's to do with things that are secondary. You know what I mean? Like bad painting or stuff that no one wants to look at, or things that they've got in duplicates, triplicates, or research collections, which is good in universities. These are the things that were used once either to teach weird pedagogical shapes and forms that aren't used anymore, or that they were artifacts that were part of an experiment, and the experiment, okay, it happened, and science overtook what we know, so this stuff is lying around, right? And that's what interests me. I want to bring these things out, and I think the museum has a duty to bring it out. I'm not talking just of ethnographic museums, all museums that have collections. And I think this is about saying, okay, we need to think of healing not just the collections, but we need to heal the citizens. We have a civic obligation towards the democratic intellect, and it is not being performed through museums that are resembling 19th century department stores. I am shocked at the similarity between, I don't know, Selfridges and another museum, or KaDeWe in Germany and other museums. And you know what? I'd rather go to a department store. I can't stand going to museums at the moment because I feel, and I don't feel that there is a space where I can work in them. I can look around and I can look and I have fun. You know, if you ever have the chance, like I did a month ago, incredible, to go into MoMA at 9:30 with no public. Wow. For 1 hour, then you just like, it's incredible experience. But to to have to deal with the public, like at an airport, in a museum, or a department store, I don't understand it. And so I think that there is a healing, a remediation necessary, and that is where the metabolic comes back, because it's a kind of mirroring between collections and people. And I don't think that's something that can be entirely done on the digital. I really feel that the younger generation has a right of access to the collections that have been gathered and hoarded, especially in ethnographic museums. And there's no way you're going to tell me that restitution has resolved the problem. Restitution touches the tiny little area, and it's not necessarily an area that is particularly interesting for a young engineer or architect or designer or artist. Not at all, actually, yeah?
Sí,
And so it obfuscates, this restitution debate is obfuscating the reality of these collections. And I write manifestos, there are manifestos in that book, for the rights of access to collections sequestered in colonial museums. And I just cannot accept that these ethnographic museums have anything to say today. Their collections are the most important that we have, that the world has, but the museums are the most corrupt and decrepit forms of prowess, of post-exploitative prowess. They still exist. We still go to them.
No sé si hay preguntas, alguien quiere intervenir. A mí me parece que es también interesante la comparación que haces entre... entre los museos y el museo como casino, que habla Teodoro Adorno, el museo como department store, como gran almacén. Pienso que en realidad, aunque, bueno, tú hablas, que me parece también muy interesante, de que la restitución es importante, es necesaria, pero que es tan lenta y que en realidad solo abarca las piezas más, digamos, las grandes obras maestras del arte africano, etcétera, que al final hay que buscar como estrategias alternativas como pueden ser las residencias de los artistas, de los abogados, escritores, etcétera, y estas colecciones de investigación, ¿no? Como manera de por lo menos sacar a la luz estas obras. Yo creo que también de los almacenes en los que están presas, pero creo que también todos los museos, aunque no tengan obras escondidas en sus almacenes, en cierto modo necesitan esta labor de un poco de, como le llamas tú, de revitalización, de restauración, en el sentido de romper con el abismo que existe entre la significación de ciertas obras en el pasado, obras que ahora, por ejemplo, nos parecen que no se deben exponer, etcétera, y la significación para la sociedad actual, para las personas actuales. Esa confrontación a través de dejar hablar a los artistas, dejar hablar a las personas que entran al museo, me parece muy importante, porque en realidad también si los visitantes del museo simplemente son personas que van digamos, a adorar la maestría de las obras de arte, tampoco conseguimos nada. Es un poco igual que si estuviesen en el depósito, ¿no? No es...
But I want to just say something quite provocative now, because in a couple of weeks I will be giving a talk with my esteemed colleague here, Agustin Perez Ribio, or Ribio Perez, I never get it right. And I want to call it Museum Vanitas, because I really think this issue of vanitas is very strong and powerful at the moment. And what I also want to say is that since I did the work in the Weltkulturen Museum, it's now totally normal for artists to be invited to ethnographic collections and to do new work around it. And it's like it happens all the time. And all sorts of artists get invited, right? And that's okay, but that's not really where I'm going with this work. With the Museum University, if I bring traps, if I take the space of the Royal Museum of Art and History, which interests me in particular because I'm looking at spaces as well, I don't want their collection in there. I want a bit of their collection, but I want stuff from the Museum of Industry and Work. I want something from the Africa collections that have been excluded from the Museum of Art and History. Maybe some creepy stuff from the Museum of Medicine. Maybe something from the collection of legal proof. There's a collection of pièces à conviction. I don't know what the word is in English or Spanish. It's that which leads you to be convicted as a criminal. You know, the testimonials, if you like. I want these things. I don't like a focus on one collection. I think it leads to vanitas. And it leads to the most dangerous thing at the moment, which is difficult to crack, and that is context. If you claim that you can only understand this glass, if I give you the right context, then you are holding on to a specialism, and you are brokering knowledge, and I don't want to be part of that trade. I want things to open up, yeah, and I am very, very wary of the kind of semantic prosthetics that are being traded in museums, so that the position of the artwork is receding more and more and more. So for me, to bring artists in is to question the role of the artist in a museum, in an exhibition today. And I am very critical of the necrophilia that is going on. There is more money being spent in scenography for dead artists than there is in production costs for living artists in museums. And I've encountered that. I've seen it happen. And I just don't want to be a part of that. It's when you work with a living artist, you cannot throw money into scenography if they don't want it. If they're dead, you do what you want. And then you promote the thrill of hobnobbing with some blue-chip gallerist or some trendy collector, and you get that work from them, and then you present it. And nothing against neo-historicist exhibitions. It's just that I think there has to be a bit more chutzpah, a bit more courage in the way we can work with our collections. And that's why I come back to the stuff that no one's interested in, or the doubles or triples, right? Because then, come on, let's get it out. Surely you can allow one of many to be subjected to research, yeah, to be subjected to an educational format, even if it gets a little bit worn, yeah, even if it's not preserved as well as it was. It has to kind of be circulation. There has to be more. I mean, Achille Mbembe said that in terms of restitution. It had to be about circulation. But at the end of the day, what was it? Proxy politics, European politics. That's all it's about. Yeah? And it doesn't touch 23 objects from Dahomey. What does that touch? 70,000 in a provincial museum in Frankfurt. If you go to the Wikipedia, you can count how many objects are in these ethnographic museums in Germany. The French don't put the numbers up. The Germans do. I don't know if the Spanish do. But you're talking millions. Yeah?
Yes.
And they're all serial. They're all connected. Yeah, because they were all taken in great part on these mass expeditions. So it's mad. It's like looking at IKEA all over the place, huh? In a brutal way. Agustín.
Bueno, si tenemos, hacemos dos preguntas, si es posible, o una o dos. Sí.
English or Spanish?
Bueno, es lo mismo.
English.
English. Okay. So thank you very much, Clementine. Always is very inspiring to listen to you, and also, you know, for the people that has not the possibility to read yet the book, I think it was perfect also to see the images that you did include. So it was a perfect appendix at the end of the reading of your book. But always, you know, I listened many of your lectures during the last years, and also you were commenting this idea of the metabolic museum in relation with the university museum, you know, and this is something really interesting in the way that you want to fit the new reality, you know, of the museums in relation with the knowledge, in relation with the public. So I'm very interested now in the experience, not as a curator, as a director, as a public. So, and always is very inspiring, or everything, you know, this type of exercises, of interventions, is like a real interference that you want to create in the space. But on the other hand, first, I always wanted to ask you this question. It's like, you were also today criticizing the way that the university, you know, because the university is something that you said before, you need an exam, you know? It's an institution that also is very elite. It's very, so I like maybe to the idea of the school, more like the, you know, here public schools are free, you know, only you have to be resident in the notion in a more, not elite, you know, perspective, more like the knowledge from the children, you know, this idea of the child. But in this relation is how, you know, there is the big importance in your project, that is the learning or the unlearning, you know? So my question is, like, always I like, and also I interview many of your students, even Renata Cerveto, you know, who was student, she always said, no, it's amazing when you are inside this, you know, university museum, how to look the things and whatever. But my question is more for general public. I run institutions, all of us, we know how is to deal with these big things that one morning maybe you have like 2,000 people or 1,000 or even 80 people. So my question is more about how we can implement these type of exercises. Of course, like to put in the space to create these inventions, these incredible chairs. But for that, you need to unlearn. In the way that later you learn other way to approach. How we can implement this in the public, you know, because as a gathering, as a, you know, 30 people today is perfect. You know, I think like with a small introduction, with a text, but how we start to unlearn things for the general public in order to, that the public in itself, with more, you know, university studies, more regular people, families, children, access to that. You know, of course, is like, you know, to give more time, to give these traces. But I would like to listen to you really not in relation to this notion of university, only for a group, and more to the ground, you know, how we can more extend this notion in a bigger scale. I don't know. I'm sure you have many examples, but I would like to listen to your how you test this.
It's a very good question, and it allows me also to make some distinctions. First of all, you can't, you know, you can talk about, you can find operational metaphors, like you can say the museum is a casino, museum is a department store. During the epidemic, I was very concerned about the empty spaces and people who were sick. So for me, a museum could also be a hospital or a lazaret. And curatorially, it would be very important because you would have to start curating the ceiling. You would have a different height. You wouldn't have the golden rule anymore. There are lots of reasons why a curator could become a nurse, etc. So, and you can think of these different metaphors, but if I use the term museum university, not university museum, because it's different. The university museums are the American system where you have a museum within a campus. And these university museums are now in a terrible dilemma. I know because I've been talking to them, that they want to become more bourgeois. They want to bring in the public, the general public. They're no longer places for research within the campus and for students within the campus, okay? So they're now becoming commercial enterprises. Okay, if I'd say museum university, I avoid having to brand something. Okay, you could say the Metabolic Museum, it could be a brand. But I'm not going to call this notion of museum university number one, right? I'm not going to call it TOF. TOF. TOF is the new brand. I saw a shop for fetish clothes today in Madrid. It was called TOF. So I thought, okay, TOF, it's in my head. I wondered why TOF and not tough or whatever. TOF, and that would be a brand. So I don't want to brand anything new. The idea that it's a museum university means that it is definitely not museum education. Okay? I come from a generation where the British museums in the 80s had museum education, but in Austria, we didn't do museum education. So I'm afraid I come from a position where I believe that artworks can actually communicate without all the stuff on the walls to explain it to you, and it's growing more and more. I believe the public is capable of coming into a museum and finding its way. I believe the public can sit down. I'm not making this project for children at all. It's not for children. It is about higher education in a museum using visual thinking. I'm not asking for every museum to do it. I'm not asking for a whole museum to do it. But I am asking for a wing of a museum. And I think that it needs the right kind of furniture. It needs vitrines on wheels. And I would do it like this. I would say every 6 weeks, 8 weeks, a new convolute comes of secondary material. So let's say we do it here. Take the big space in the entrance. It's free, right? It's maybe there's certain parameters that people get to know that you don't, you turn your phones off or it's quiet, right? There are proper tables to sit at. There are computers or people bring their laptops. It's not this weird furniture that you get in museums that is kind of where you're going to lie and you don't know what you're doing on it, but it's there to work. It doesn't matter if somebody comes in and reads a newspaper or even reads their telephone for 5 hours, I don't care. But then what happens is that, it's the 21st of June. There's the convolute coming from the Prado. How interesting. Let's find out what the secondary material is. And people come for the delivery of the collection. And that collection rubs off or overlaps with 1 or 2, minimum 1, if not in total 3 other collections that have nothing to do with one another. So the Technical Museum in Madrid or the Museum of Locomotives, or I don't know what museums you have, that material is brought and is sort of juxtaposed then with the weird paintings from the Prado that no one wants to look at for 500 years or 300 years. So the idea is that you don't need themes anymore. Yeah, you change the timing of reception, the timing of transaction in the museum, and I mean, I thought about it when I saw these unexhibitable paintings with my students, and I saw then the Ottoneum, the natural history collections with them. We looked at a lot of stuff, and then I thought, what are people waiting for? Let's fill the Fridericianum with all these collections and make a museum university. People will come in coach loads to see what the next convolute is. People want to see what is here. And the more I walk on the pavements in European cities, the more I think I'm going to be in a science fiction film, and this stuff is going to suddenly move up, grow out, break out. It's too much. And this, the fear that the public might not get it, or that it might be too elitist, or that it... No, there's every right to have a higher education based on visual material in a museum. What are we doing? Yeah, already it's so difficult to go to even in an Institute of Contemporary Art, you're being forced to write some stupid plain language on the wall. What is plain language? I mean, then when you ask people, they say, well, you know, art is very inaccessible. And then you think, well, why the hell do artists continue to produce then? Why are we making stuff if everything has to be broken down into another language form or another perceptual form? It doesn't make sense anymore. And I'm really, really, you know, I don't want to be told what it is I'm looking at. I don't want the authority of ideology, what Rancière called the ideology of explanation. I also want to be able to put together my own understanding of history. And I think that's what is going on with the decolonial. That's what the Saidiya Hartmans and the Ariela Azoulay and other thinkers along those lines, they want the next generation to also be able to write its own history. And you cannot do that unless you have access to collections. You can't. It'll remain on a discursive level where academics will be in corridors. In fact, more people will go to academia to be able to deal with this kind of material. So it's I'm not giving you I'm not God. I'm not trying to give you the ideal museum. All I'm saying is that I'm on the side of the artist and I'm not on the side of the educator. And so if I do a museum university, it's because I believe in the role of artworks and artists and transdisciplinarity and expressive gatherings, and I want to see what would happen if we tried it out. I tried it out and it worked. It worked. I tried it on a smaller scale with skin in the game, and I had people for hours in the exhibition working. Yeah, they do. Yeah, it's nice to usurp the heating and the light and the comfort and above all the artworks when in today's world seems to me really important.
I was wondering, you already talked a little bit about, but maybe if you had like a few more specific examples of some of the occurrences on the exhibitions that were happening, how the visual thinking would take place. You showed a few pictures on those exhibitions. Yeah. I was just curious because I understand your point on the against education, although it might be maybe quite tricky to how to escape the communication process of a common education with an exchange of information. I'm wondering if that is occurring when the gathering is taking place. I had that little question. I was wondering, thinking on the infrastructure of all the museum aspects that you would take into consideration, whether in your museum there was some guards or security people, and if in that case there was also another kind of approach within the exchange of art making and art thinking together within that scale of community. And then I just wanted to tell you, thank you for mentioning the main hall space, because when I arrived into the museum, in this incredible hall with just 4 paintings and just a bunch of plants, I was so surprised by such the main space in the museum here. And you know, it's such a beautiful space, yeah, but it's the same for the last 15 years, you know, yeah. And it's really surprising.
That would be perfect, exactly. One example of the way the museum worked, and there's a book come out called The Future of the Dutch Colonial Past. It's a very strange book. It's been designed backwards. But in there's a long piece around the work that I did with the artist from Fiji and New Zealand called Luke Willis-Thompson. So Luke Willis-Thompson, I had seen his work in Auckland, and I invited him, and he asked the custodians, it's briefly described in there, but in the other article it's longer. He asked them for anything that coerces somebody, holds them down, prevents bodily movements, whatever. And they found different things, and he looked at them in the laboratory for 3 weeks. In particular, a piece from New Ireland, a mask made out of a skull, and with a bar on it, so that the dancer would put the human skull against their own face and bite the bar, and then the skull would be on their face. And he looked at it again and again and again, and you know, this is 2014. so there was a question of restitution of human remains, but it wasn't like it is today, the debate. And there were other things, shackles, and there were some shamanistic chains from I think, Inuit. And he looked at this skull. And after 3 weeks, he came to me with a concept note. And he said, look, I want to give my fee to somebody who is in the process of repatriating a dead body from Frankfurt to wherever they come from. Not Hungary or right, Italy or somewhere, but that has a resonance with the collection. And Yvette Mutumba, who was my curator for Africa, who I brought into the museum, first curator of African descent, to have the right to look after her collection. She and Luc went off to find a broker, because if he wanted to give 2,000 euros, 1,500, I can't remember, it wasn't a lot, but nevertheless, if he wanted to give this money to somebody towards the repatriation of a deceased person, then he had to find the person, the broker. So they tried hospitals, didn't work. We had Ethiopian contacts, that didn't work. They met a Congolese priest, that didn't work. And then eventually they found an imam. And Luc's negotiation was to have some kind of memento mori of the person that he wanted to exhibit along with the mask and the shackles and the other thing. And Mr. Shaheen, the imam, said to him, look, I'm going to bifurcate your project. I will give you photographs of my son who died recently at the age of 20, but couldn't be buried in Egypt because he was already a German national, so I had to bury him here. I will give you photographs of him, and you will give me the 1,500, and I will give it to a family whose identity will remain unknown. That way, there is a certain, grace around their identity. They're not being exhibited. And that's what we did. He got 1,500 in cash, and we showed the photographs in a room nearby, these really brutal photographs taken by the director of the museum. And when people walked in and they saw these photographs of the boy, they saw the shackles, they saw the skull, suddenly, and it was there were the certificates and the letters from the museum in German and in English, transferring the money to Shaheen. Suddenly, this whole question of restitution was on turnaround. Suddenly, it was about, hey, guys, we're talking about some Benin bronzes, and there are people who are popping it every day in Frankfurt. There's so many people who come to Frankfurt to work who don't belong to the German state, right? Who can't be buried in Germany. And there's a whole, as Saskia Sassen would say, there's a whole nother, below the radar, a whole nother ethical, aesthetic, economic, political infrastructure that is dealing with this. And for the first time, the museum had a real reason to want to beckon people from different communities into its space. It wasn't saying, oh, we must get everybody from the communities into the museum. There was an absolute reason for this research, right? That, I think, was probably for me one of the most brilliant kind of twists that only an artist could have done. No curator would have done it. No way. No educator in the normal sense of let's do a nice educational program would have thought of handing money out for this kind of process of repatriation. Yeah? Then you asked me something else, and I can't remember what it is.
We have to quit.
We have
sorry,
to talk about it
thank you very much,
yes.
Because it's too late. Thank you to you, all to you. Thank you, Clementine.
Thank you, Juan. Thank you. And